The mirror reflected more than just my appearance. It revealed the restlessness in my eyes, the tension in my shoulders. I ran my fingers along the thin strap of my dress, adjusting it even though it wasn't out of place. The fabric clung to my body in a way that felt deliberate, like an unspoken desire pressing against my skin. I exhaled and turned away. This was ridiculous. I had never doubted myself like this before. The sound of a door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up and he was there, leaning against the doorway. His posture was casual, but his eyes weren't. They lingered just for a second too long. A warmth spread over me, creeping along my neck. I gripped the edge of the dresser, pretending to adjust an earring, as if that simple movement could shatter the weight in the air. "Sorry," he said, his voice smooth but unreadable. "Didn't realize you were in here." My throat tightened. "It's fine," I replied, but the words came out softer than I intended. I saw the way his gaze flickered downward briefly before he pulled away. And then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of his cologne in the air, something sharp and fresh that unsettled me in a way I didn't want to admit. That night at the dinner table I played my role perfectly. My husband sat beside me, oblivious, scrolling through his phone between bites of food. We had been together for years and our relationship was solid. Predictable. Secure. And yet, as I reached for my wine glass, I caught his eyes across the table, my husband's son, watching me for just a moment too long before looking away. I shouldn't have noticed. I shouldn't have cared. But I did. Later that night, alone in my bedroom, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My husband was already asleep beside me, his steady breathing a familiar background noise. I turned onto my side, pressing my legs together, my body betraying me with a slow, creeping awareness. The air in the house felt different now, charged with something I couldn't name. The following morning, I got dressed more carefully than usual. I chose a dress that skimmed the tops of my thighs and let my hair fall loose over my shoulders. It wasn't for anyone but me, I told myself that over and over. Downstairs, the kitchen was filled with the scent of coffee. I moved through the space as if everything was normal, as if I hadn't spent the night replaying moments that should have meant nothing. He was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in his hand. His gaze flickered to me when I entered, but he said nothing. I reached for a plate, and in that small movement I felt it. His presence closer than expected. The brush of warmth as he passed behind me, the almost imperceptible graze of his fingers against my arm. It was nothing. And yet it wasn't. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, gripping the plate a little too tightly. There was no flirtation, no spoken words that crossed a line. But something had shifted between us, something intangible and dangerous. I turned away, taking a steadying breath. This was absurd. I was imagining things. At least that's what I told myself. But that evening, when I stood in the hallway and heard his voice from another room, my body reacted before my mind did. A quiet pulse at the base of my stomach, an awareness that had nothing to do with logic. And when I walked past him, his gaze followed me. Slow, deliberate. I shouldn't have noticed. But I did. The next few days I convinced myself it was all in my head. A fleeting moment, a harmless glance, an overactive imagination searching for something that wasn't really there. But my body betrayed me. It started with small things. I took longer in the mornings to get ready, lingering in front of the mirror, smoothing my dress over my hips with an attention I never used to give myself. My fingers hovered over different fabrics in my closet, hesitating between the comfortable and the subtly revealing. I told myself it was for me, that I just wanted to feel good again. But when I walked downstairs and caught his eyes flicker downward, barely perceptible but undeniably there, I knew it wasn't just for me. The shift was quiet, subtle, like a slow-burning ember rather than a raging fire. It lived in the pauses between our conversations, in the weight of a glance that lasted half a second too long. I told myself it was nothing. But then came the touch. It happened in the kitchen. I reached for a mug and he was there, stepping closer than necessary, his arm brushing mine. The warmth of his skin was startling, a stark contrast to the cool porcelain between my fingers. I should have moved away. Instead I froze. The contact lasted only a second, maybe less. But it was enough. My skin tingled long after he pulled back, after he took his coffee and left the room as if nothing had happened. I stood there, gripping the mug with both hands, my breath shallow. It was ridiculous. It was nothing. Except my body knew better. That night, lying beside my husband, I thought about that moment more than I cared to admit. The way the space between us kept shrinking. The way my heart beat a little too fast when I felt his presence near me. The way I wasn't supposed to want this. The following afternoon, I found myself alone with him again. It wasn't planned, not really, but I didn't stop it from happening either. My husband was running late, caught up in work, and I was home early. He was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I hovered for a moment, unsure if I should leave. Instead I sat. He glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression, before returning his attention to the screen. A few minutes passed. Then he spoke. "You always look nice," he said, not looking up. It was so casual, so effortless, as if he were stating a fact. I felt my pulse quicken. Thank you." He nodded, still not looking at me, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. A knowing. The silence stretched. I should have left then. Instead, I crossed my legs, shifting just enough to make my dress ride up slightly. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. But he noticed. His gaze dropped for the briefest moment before flicking back to his phone, his jaw tightening. Neither of us spoke after that. But the air between us changed. And when I left the room, I could feel his eyes on me, lingering long after I disappeared from view. I wasn't sure when I stopped resisting the thought of him. At first, it had been something I pushed to the back of my mind, something that lurked in the shadows of my consciousness but never fully surfaced. But now it was there, present, breathing alongside me in every moment we shared the same space. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things, that it was natural for attraction to exist without acting on it. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. It wasn't just attraction. It was a pull, a slow and steady magnetism that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but both of us felt. It became impossible to ignore. I started to notice the way my body responded to his presence before my mind could intervene. The way my breath caught when he walked into the room, the way I tensed when he moved too close, the way my stomach clenched when our eyes met for too long. And then, the moment that changed everything. I had been in the shower, letting the hot water wash away the weight of the day. My husband had left early for work and I was alone in the house, at least I thought I was. I stepped out of the bathroom, my skin still damp, wrapped in nothing but a towel. My hair dripped onto my shoulders as I padded down the hallway toward my bedroom. That's when I saw him. He was standing near the doorway, his eyes locked onto me before he had the chance to look away. A slow breath left my lips, my fingers gripping the edge of the towel as if it were the only thing tethering me to sanity. His gaze didn't waver. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, like the moments before a storm. Then he took a step forward. Something in my chest tightened. I should have walked past him. I should have laughed it off, acted as though nothing had happened, as though his presence didn't make my skin prickle with heat. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there waiting. And then he was close enough that I could feel his breath against my cheek, close enough that the scent of him filled the space around me. My grip on the towel tightened. His voice was quiet. "You look..." He stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. I swallowed, my throat dry. "I thought you weren't home." "I wasn't," he said, his gaze still locked onto mine. My heart pounded in my chest, the space between us closing inch by inch. Then, without thinking, without allowing logic to interfere, I lifted my chin. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but he caught it. And then it happened. His lips touched mine, tentative at first, testing, waiting for resistance that never came. A soft gasp escaped me, my fingers twitching against the fabric of the towel. But then reality crashed down on me like cold water. I pulled away, my breath uneven, my heart hammering so loudly that I swore he could hear it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally I stepped back, shaking my head. This can't happen. His expression was unreadable. I turned and walked away before I could do something I wouldn't be able to undo. But as I closed the door behind me, pressing my back against it, my fingers still tingled where they had brushed against his skin. And I knew. It was already too late. I spent the rest of the day pretending nothing had happened. I busied myself with tasks that didn't need to be done. Straightening pillows, reorganizing cabinets, folding clothes that weren't even out of place. I tried to distract myself, to shake the feeling of his lips against mine, the warmth of his breath on my skin. But every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that moment. It wasn't just the kiss that haunted me, it was what it meant. I had crossed a line. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to step back over it. By the time evening arrived, I had convinced myself that if I acted normal, things would return to the way they were. That it had been a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness, nothing more. But when I stepped into the dining room and saw him already sitting at the table, I knew immediately that it wasn't that simple. He didn't look at me at first. His fingers drummed against the edge of his glass, his posture too casual to be natural. But the moment I moved past him, he lifted his head and our eyes met. A slow burn spread through me, heat curling at the base of my stomach. I gripped the back of my chair, forcing myself to breathe. Dinner passed in a blur. My husband sat across from me, oblivious, scrolling through emails between bites of food. I responded when necessary, nodding at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. Across the table where he sat, his gaze heavy on me when he thought no one was looking. I should have felt guilt. I should have been drowning in it. But instead all I felt was anticipation. That night I stayed in the bathroom longer than necessary, staring at my reflection, searching for something. Remorse, hesitation, doubt. I found none of it. What I did find was a quiet thrill buried beneath my ribs, something dark and insistent, something that whispered, "You want more." I should have gone to bed. I should have walked back into that room, curled up beside my husband and let sleep take me. Instead I found myself in the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but my body did. When I reached the dimly lit living room, I stopped. He was there, stretched out on the couch, one arm draped over the back, his eyes closed. I should have turned around. Instead I lingered. His eyes opened as if he had sensed me, and for a moment neither of us moved. He sat up slowly, his gaze traveling over me. The air between us was thick, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. Finally, he broke the silence. "You can't pretend this didn't happen." My pulse quickened. "I don't know what you're talking about." A small smirk tugged at his lips, but his eyes stayed serious. "You do." I did. I swallowed hard, my nails digging into my palm. "This is dangerous." His voice softened, but there was something resolute beneath it. "Then stop me." It was an open invitation, a test. I should have taken it. I should have turned and walked away, put distance between us before it was too late. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step forward. His eyes darkened, his breath hitching just slightly. And in that moment I knew, whatever was happening between us, whatever line we had already crossed, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. The night after the kiss, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband's arm draped over my waist in a gesture that should have been comforting. But it wasn't. It felt foreign, distant, like a weight rather than an embrace. I closed my eyes, willing myself to feel something: love, guilt, regret. Instead, all I felt was the echo of earlier. The tension, the heat, the anticipation. It was wrong. It was insane. But it was real. The next morning, I moved through the house with practiced ease, pretending that nothing had changed. I went through the motions of routine, preparing breakfast, cleaning up, responding to my husband's casual conversation with nods and small smiles. But beneath the surface I was waiting. Waiting for him to walk into the room. Waiting to see if his eyes would find mine again. Waiting for the moment we'd be alone. And then it happened. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes in the sink when I felt it, that shift in the air, that awareness that prickled along the back of my neck. I didn't have to turn around to know he was there. So I did. He leaned against the doorway watching me. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes weren't. They held something sharp, something knowing. I swallowed, gripping the edge of the counter. The sound of my husband's voice from another room broke the silence, reminding me of the world outside this charged moment. I turned back to the sink, forcing myself to focus. I felt him move before I saw it. His presence shifting closer, the air between us thickening. His hand brushed against mine as he reached for a glass beside the sink, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through my body. I inhaled sharply. It wasn't an accident. He lingered just a moment longer than necessary before stepping away, his fingers grazing my wrist as he pulled back. I forced myself to keep washing the dishes, ignoring the way my heart pounded in my chest. This was dangerous. But I didn't stop it. Later that evening, I found myself alone in the living room. My husband was in his office on yet another late-night call, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the television I wasn't really watching. Then I heard him. His footsteps. The sound of him approaching. I didn't move. He settled onto the couch beside me, too close. His leg barely brushed mine, but it was enough. We sat in silence, the space between us shrinking without words. I wasn't sure if you'd avoid me today, he said finally. I exhaled slowly. I thought about it. But you didn't. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. Neither did you. A muscle in his jaw tightened. His hand rested on his knee, fingers flexing slightly as if he were fighting the urge to move. I didn't know who leaned in first. Maybe it was both of us. But suddenly the distance was gone. His breath was warm against my cheek, his presence overwhelming. I should have stopped it. I should have stood up, walked away, ended this before it spiraled further out of control. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want to. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. That night, after he left the room, after the weight of his gaze lingered on my skin like an invisible imprint, I sat in the dim glow of the television, trying to convince myself that I still had control. But control had been slipping from my fingers for weeks. I turned the TV off and climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in a rhythm that didn't match the stillness of the house. My husband was asleep, his back turned toward my side of the bed, his breathing deep and even. I slid beneath the covers, pressing my palms against my stomach as if I could physically hold down the chaos inside me. I knew what I had to do. I had to put distance between us. I had to remind myself that this was dangerous, destructive, a slow unraveling that would only lead to something I couldn't take back. But when morning came, the first thing I thought about was him. It was a sickness, this hunger. An ache that grew worse the more I tried to starve it. The day passed in a blur, my focus fractured, my body restless. I threw myself into meaningless tasks. Cleaning, errands, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. And yet all it took was a simple moment to pull me under again. Late that afternoon, my husband left for a meeting. The house was quiet, sunlight filtering through the windows in golden slants. I stood in the hallway, aware of my own breathing, of the silence pressing in around me. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. I turned just as he appeared at the top of the stairs. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they burned. I should have said something. I should have created space, built a wall between us before the last barrier crumbled. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen in place as he took another step forward. And then another. He was close now, the air between us charged with something thick and unspoken. I know you feel it, he murmured. My breath caught. I felt everything. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This is wrong. He finished for me, his voice quiet but certain. Yes, that was the answer. But it wasn't the one I gave. Because before I could stop myself, before I could think or reason or remember all the consequences waiting in the dark, I closed the remaining space between us. Our lips met in a collision of heat and hesitation, a moment that teetered on the edge of destruction. This kiss was different from the first. Slower. Deeper. Not a mistake, not a fleeting moment of weakness, but a choice. I gripped his shirt, my knuckles white with the effort of holding onto something I had already lost control of. His hands found my waist, fingertips pressing just hard enough to make me shiver. I should have pulled away. Instead, I melted into him, into the warmth of his body, into the quiet sigh that slipped from my lips before I could stop it. The sound must have shaken something loose in him because his grip tightened, his kiss turning hungrier, more desperate. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was the moment I had to end it. I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to stop. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I pulled back, breaking the kiss but not the closeness. His forehead rested against mine, his breath uneven. We can't, I whispered. His fingers traced slow, deliberate circles on my hip. Then tell me to leave. I opened my mouth. No words came. Because I didn't want him to. And we both knew it. I told myself I could still stop this. That what had happened upstairs was only a moment, a lapse in judgment. That if I stepped away now, I could still go back to the life I had before. But that life no longer fit. The truth was, I had already let the fire consume me. There was no going back. I avoided him for the next few days, throwing myself into routines with a desperate attempt at normalcy. I made small talk with my husband at breakfast, asked about his meetings, forced myself to listen even as my mind drifted. I cooked, cleaned, filled my days with errands, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. But nothing helped, because even in the silence he was there. I felt his absence like a physical weight, my skin burning with the memory of his touch. Every brush of fabric against my body reminded me of the way his hands had felt, the way his lips had moved against mine. And at night, when my husband pulled me close in his sleep, my body remained still, my mind elsewhere. By the third day, the tension became unbearable. I caught glimpses of him in the house, the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. It was a quiet torment, a game of restraint neither of us was willing to acknowledge. But restraint only lasted so long. It happened in the garage. I had gone out to grab something from the car, expecting to be alone. But as I turned, he was there, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me. I froze. He didn't speak at first. He just stared, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy in the confined space. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the keys in my hand. You shouldn't be here. He tilted his head slightly. Neither should you. The air between us was thick, suffocating. I tried to move past him, to escape before I did something I couldn't take back, but he shifted, blocking my path. My breath caught. Why are you avoiding me? His voice was low, rough around the edges. I forced myself to meet his gaze. You know why. His jaw tightened. Then say it. I didn't. I couldn't. Because putting it into words would make it real, would strip away the thin veil of denial I had clung to for weeks. Instead, I did the worst thing I could have done. I let my silence speak for me. The moments stretched unbearably long before he took a step forward. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. His hands found my waist, his grip firm, possessive. A sharp inhale escaped me, my fingers twitching against his chest, caught between pushing him away and pulling him closer. You don't want me to stop, he murmured. I closed my eyes, swallowing the truth that burned at the back of my throat. And then his lips were on mine again, and whatever resolve I had left shattered. The kiss was desperate, reckless, a collision of everything we had held back for too long. I clung to him, nails digging into his shoulders as he pressed me back against the car, the metal cool against my overheated skin. I wanted to stop. I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want to let go. Not now. Not ever. I told myself that what happened in the garage was the last time. That I would pull away, put an end to this before it spiraled even further out of control. But the moment I saw him again, I knew I had been lying to myself. The days blurred together, a careful balancing act between maintaining my life as it was and drowning in the desire I had spent so long suppressing. My husband had suggested we take a short trip out to the countryside. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend away from the city, a chance to unwind. I had agreed before I could think too much about it. Maybe space would help. Maybe being away from him would give me the clarity I so desperately needed. But fate had other plans. Because he was coming with us. I told myself it didn't matter. That I could handle it. That I would behave. And yet, as we drove down winding roads, fields stretching endlessly on either side, I felt a quiet tension pressing down on my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He sat in the back seat, looking out the window, the golden light from the setting sun casting a soft glow over his face. I turned away too quickly, gripping the wheel tighter. When we arrived, the farm was just as I remembered. Open, endless, filled with the scent of earth and fresh air. It was my husband's friend's place, a quiet escape they used when the city became too suffocating. The house was old but well kept, surrounded by rolling fields and a scattering of trees that swayed lazily in the evening breeze. The moment we stepped out of the car, he looked around, curiosity written all over his face. I noticed the way he took everything in, the vastness, the quiet, the unfamiliarity of it all. He had grown up in the city. He had never been to a place like this. His eyes flicked to me and I smiled, unable to hold back a small laugh. You look like you've stepped into another world, I teased. His lips quirked into a smirk. It feels like I have. It was strange, seeing him here, away from the house, away from the unspoken tension that had become a constant between us. For a moment it almost felt safe. Almost. The next afternoon I found him wandering near the back of the property, watching everything with that same quiet fascination. I decided to show him something. We walked to the far end of the yard, where the sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in soft gold. Under the shade of a sprawling tree, wooden crates stood filled with freshly picked fruit, their scent thick in the warm air. I knelt down, reaching into one of the boxes, my fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the ripe produce. I picked up 2 large, perfect ones and turned, offering them to him. Here, I said. He stepped closer, his gaze flickering between the fruit and my face. His fingers brushed against mine as he took one, and for a moment we both froze. They're huge, he muttered, examining them with wide eyes. I laughed softly. You've never seen them fresh like this before? He shook his head. Not like this. There was something almost childlike about his curiosity, an unguarded wonder that made my chest tighten. The sun dipped lower, painting everything in deeper hues of amber and crimson. The hum of insects filled the air, mixing with the distant sound of rustling leaves. I knew this moment would stay with him. And yet, even in its innocence, there was danger lurking beneath the surface. Because standing there in the golden light, his fingers still curled around the fruit I had given him, I realized something. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many excuses I made, I couldn't escape this. I didn't want to. I should have stepped away. Standing there, under the heavy golden light of the setting sun, I should have pulled back, created space, reminded myself that this had to end. But I didn't move. Neither did he. His fingers still brushed against mine, the warmth of his skin lingering longer than necessary. It was such a small thing, such an insignificant touch, and yet it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't control. The moment stretched, the world around us fading into a blur of colors and distant sounds. The scent of ripe fruit hung in the air, thick and intoxicating, mixing with the faint traces of his cologne. He was watching me. Not the way he had before, not with curiosity or amusement, but with something else. Something deeper. Something that terrified me. I let out a slow breath and stepped back, breaking the connection between us. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, as if I could physically restrain myself from reaching for him again. This is dangerous, I murmured, more to myself than to him. He didn't look away. I know. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. We have to stop. A muscle in his jaw tensed, but he nodded. If that's what you want. It wasn't. But it had to be. I turned away before I could change my mind, before I could let the pull between us win. The wooden crates creaked under my hands as I steadied myself, grounding myself in the rough texture of the old wood. Behind me, I heard his quiet footsteps as he walked away. The moment he was gone, my body sagged with the weight of restraint. I needed to get control of myself. I needed to end this. But that night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, staring at the dark ceiling, I knew the truth. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want this to end. And worse, I didn't think I could. The next morning, I woke up early, slipping out of bed before my husband stirred. I needed air, space, distance. I stepped outside, the cool morning breeze wrapping around me, carrying the scent of damp earth and dew-covered grass. The farm was still quiet, the world not yet fully awake. I walked without direction, my thoughts tangled, my emotions a mess of contradictions. I had never felt so out of control. So alive. I stopped near the barn, leaning against the wooden beams, letting my head fall back as I exhaled slowly. And then I heard him. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. He stopped just behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him against my back. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged with everything we weren't saying. Finally, he broke the silence. Did you sleep? I let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Not much. Me neither. His voice was low, rough. Dangerous. I closed my eyes, my fingers gripping the wooden beam tighter. This has to stop, I whispered. He was quiet for a moment. Then why does it feel like neither of us wants it to? I turned then, slowly, my breath hitching as I met his gaze. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with something I didn't want to name. Something I felt mirrored in my own. I should have walked away. I should have ended this. Instead, I let myself drown. His lips were on mine before I could think, before I could remind myself of all the reasons this was wrong. But nothing about it felt wrong. It felt inevitable. Like gravity. Like fate. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, letting myself fall completely. And this time I didn't think about what would happen next. Because in that moment nothing else mattered.